Hello and welcome back to another video exploration of the story. My name is Scott Dalen, an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I'm presenting these videos weekly as a companion to go along with a Bible study that we are doing in my congregation based on something called The Story. Kind of sort of looks like that in its first iteration. The Story is a condensed Bible narrative put together a few years back by a guy named Randy Frazee that's really aimed at helping an individual to engage in the narrative that is presented over the course of the Bible, kind of from start to finish. Now, there's portions that are condensed down and summarized. There are certain portions of the Bible that are not so narrative driven that are kind of cut out so that we have that story form, kind of almost like a novel in terms of what is presented within the book itself, chapter by chapter. Now, this particular week, we explored chapter 20, which is entitled "The Queen of Beauty and Courage." This particular chapter is taken from the Old Testament book of Esther. Esther is, of course, the queen in question in terms of the title itself. Now, as we are, or where we're kind of at in the course of the history right now, we are towards the end of the period of exile, following the Babylonian exile that occurred in about the year 585 BCE, give or take. My dates are a little fuzzy, but right about that time is when the southern kingdom of Judah and the capital of Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians, and they were hauled off to exile. Now, we've kind of been in that period for the last few chapters. We heard about the exile itself. We also heard about the story of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were some of the exiles who rose to prominence while in Babylon and then later Persia, which was the empire that took over the Babylonians. During that history. We've also heard the story of when the Persians allowed the Jewish exiles to return back to Jerusalem and begin to rebuild there. That was kind of what we looked at in the last video. But now this particular story still happens within that time period. It's actually listed under the reign of King Xerxes of the Persian Empire. Now, from records that we have, his reign was 21 years, from 486 to 465 BCE. So we're still looking about 4.5 centuries before Jesus, but we're coming right down towards the end of the Old Testament period that we have writings within the Bible narrative. Now, if you're wondering about Xerxes, if you've ever seen the movie 300, came out a few years back about the Spartans throwing off the Persian invaders with King Leonidas. It was a big fancy movie, and they made a sequel. That King Xerxes is the guy that's listed, or that's depicted there, although it's kind of a weird depiction. Definitely wouldn't put any credence into it. But anyway, that's kind of who it is. Now, again, as I mentioned, Xerxes reigns for 21 years when he is first king. He is married, and his queen is Queen Vashti. She will come into the story momentarily, but she kind of falls from grace, and we have Esther, who is a young Jewish girl who ends up becoming the new queen, and then things kind of continue on through that. Now, in terms of the period of history that we're looking at, even within Xerxes' reign, we're kind of looking at about the first half of it. When these events occur, and Esther's portion of the story is about a quarter, maybe a third of it, and like the second quarter. So, like if Xerxes' reign was a football game, Esther would kind of be around in the second quarter. That's kind of what we hear about. So, in addition to Esther, also we hear about Mordecai. Now, Mordecai is her cousin. And also her adopted father. Kind of an odd situation there. Really speaks into the Jewish sense of a family, the males in the family caring for the women whenever a situation occurs. So we just have little snippets about how Esther's parents died, and so Mordecai, being her closest male relative, cared for her. As he adopted her and raised her as his own daughter, it's thought he was probably quite a bit older than her, and So it was more of a parent-child relationship that way, but they were cousins, and that's kind of the information we get. Now, in terms of where they fall, going back to the Babylonian captivity, like I talked about, the Babylonian captivity happened, like I said, 580-ish, and then there's Mordecai and Esther are in the fourth generation after that happened. Now, when they are living, or at least what we know in terms of Xerxes' reign, this is during the time when a lot of the Jewish people have already returned to Jerusalem, and the rebuilding is already ongoing. Um, and yet we know from things of this nature, stories like this one, that not all of the Jewish people returned to the promised land. Some of them stayed where they were. They'd already been there. They were established. It was kind of the next generation by the time, or even a couple generations by the time they were released to go back. So some of them just stayed to continue their lives as they have known them. And it would seem that Mordecai and Esther kind of fall into that category. So they are still around. They're still, and we don't know exactly where they live. It's thought perhaps that they lived right there in the capital because of Mordecai's ability to stay close to Esther. We don't know exactly. That's not given to us. But essentially what goes on throughout the course of this, and kind of what we talked about, we talked our way through the narrative. This is a fairly familiar story. They actually made a movie of it a few years back, like One Night with the King or Two Nights with the King or something like that. I forget exactly what it was called, but what goes on is as we start out, and I mentioned this earlier. So there's the king and there's Vashti, his queen. Now the narrative starts off 3 years into Xerxes' reign. So he's been on the throne for a little while, must be about 483 ish, and he throws a big party, like big party. It lasts for half a year, 180 days. We hear that there's this celebration going on. It's for all kind of the bigwigs from around the empire. And we talked in it about what's his motivation? Why does he do this? On one hand, he's wining and dining them, maybe to make them happy. But on the other hand, it really kind of seems like his pride is on display here, because it's like, look at all that I have. Look at all that I control. Look at all that I can give you. And it's very likely leaders from all around the empire, and potentially leaders from some of these different little kingdoms that have been conquered, that it's like, hey, we control you, but I'm going to try and make you happy, and also let you see my power so that you don't try and rise up against us. So anyway, this party goes on for 180 days, and then after that he throws a feast, which lasts for another week. So, go big. They have big parties. And after this week of feasting and drinking, we hear he was merry with wine, and decided that he was going to call in his queen, Queen Vashti. Well, at the same time, Vashti's been having a celebration with all the women, all the wives. That's all been going on at the same time in a different part of the palace. But so he sends messengers to Vashti saying, "Come to me." And she refuses. Now, there's a lot of different speculation as to why she refuses. Some scholars think that he wanted to just parade her around, potentially naked, like, oh, look at my beautiful wife. She's the most desirable woman in the world. Some think that perhaps she was being called in to dance for the guests, potentially, well, who knows? We don't exactly know. Perhaps there was some implied hanky-panky going on. We don't really know. Despite whatever was going on, Vashti refuses. And the king is mad because she has defied his orders. Now, here's the thing about the king in Persia. We've heard this before, and it comes up a couple of times in this chapter, that when the king issues an edict or a law or a declaration, whatever you want to call it, it cannot be refuted. It cannot be changed. Even if the king decides, I don't like this thing that I made, I want to change it, they can't. The law will not allow it. When the king makes a decree, it is permanent, period. And so that, in addition with the fact that women were still property at the time, I'm not saying it's right, that's just the way things were in the culture. For a wife to defy her husband was a big no-no. So not only is Xerxes angry, but all of his advisors are mad, and everybody's like, we need to deal with this, otherwise other women will find out that she's defied you, and there'll be chaos. All women will start to defy their husbands, and our very cultural thing will be lost. I mean, that seems to really be at stake for them. So they go back and forth and back and forth. What are we going to do? And finally they say, they say, "Great king, make a decree that never again shall Vashti come into your presence, and let someone else be raised up to take her place." So we don't know exactly what happens to Vashti other than she's shunted aside. We don't know if she's like thrown off in some dungeon or taken to some different palace where she's never seen again. We don't know if she's killed. We don't know. Basically, at this point of the story, she exits the story, and we don't hear about her anymore. Uh, and so time goes by, and then we hear that Xerxes uh, begins to miss her. Whether he misses her directly or he misses having a wife or whatever, we don't exactly know. But so then they go out and they make another decree: go out and find young virgins from around the whole nation, and bring them into the palace, bring them into the harem, and one of them will become the new queen. And this really speaks to the fact that individuals had no rights within these empires, that the king's word was law, that they were, even if they didn't seem like it, they were slaves to his whim. So these different individuals went around and they'd be like, "That's a good looking girl, that's a good looking girl, that's a good looking girl," and no matter what the girls or their families thought about it, they had to come with them, and they probably never saw them again. They were brought into the palace. They were put into the harem. Well, harem, if you're familiar with the term, basically means a whole slug of women that are at the whim of the king. And so then they go through a year's worth of beauty treatments, and we don't know what exactly that is, but so they go to the spa for a year, and then one by one they're taken to the king, and they go in and they're with the king overnight, and the one that pleases him is the one that will become the new queen. Well, lo and behold, it's Esther. Esther is one of the girls who was chosen at the prodding of Mordecai, her guardian. She doesn't reveal that she's a Jewish person, and we talked quite a bit about that, about why wouldn't she want to reveal that she's Jewish, and we don't really have a good answer to that question, other than at this time period we know that there's a lot of discord against the Jewish people, at least around Jerusalem, around Judah. Some from what we heard in the last chapter in the last video, a lot of the neighboring cultures, neighboring nations, really are not happy with them, that they are rebuilding. They don't want that to happen. So maybe there's some of that going on. But again, we don't exactly know. But for whatever reason, Mordecai tells Esther, "Don't reveal that you're Jewish." So she doesn't, at least not initially. So she goes in, she pleases the king, and she becomes queen. Well, this is like 4 years after Vashti has been set aside. So already quite a bit of time has gone on. We're like 7 years into Xerxes' reign now. So that she becomes queen. Mordecai continues to hang around, and we continue to hear about him. Well, he ends up ticking off a guy named Haman. Haman is second in command in the entire empire. He's second only to Xerxes, basically as high up as you can go without being the emperor. That's where Haman is. But like we've heard before in the story of Daniel and in the story of Shadrach and Benny, as I like to call them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman. He just refuses. Now, will he bow to the king? Well, we don't know, because it's never really given to, or that information is never given to us. Does he only bow to God? Perhaps. Again, we don't know. We're not given that information. All we know is that he refuses to bow down to Haman, and that drives Haman batty. Why would this one guy not bow down to me? Well, he finds out that Mordecai is Jewish, and the wheels start turning. Now, we're given this tiny little clue as to why Haman hates the Jewish people so much, and he's an Agatite, which Agatites are descendants of the king of Agag, which was one of the kings that King Saul, way back, first king of Israel, conquered as Israel and the surrounding area was being unified under the single king. And so he probably has a distaste for the Jewish culture because of that. But he sees an opportunity, and like a long time goes by, but he's plotting and plotting and plotting, not only wanting to take revenge on Mordecai, who has damaged his pride by not bowing down to him, but also to dispose of the entire Jewish nation. In the meantime, and I need to give this little side note because it's important. In the meantime, while Mordecai is hanging around by the palace gates, which is where he always seems to hang out for whatever reason. He overhears a couple of the palace guards plotting to kill Xerxes. So he alerts them. And we don't know where his loyalty comes from. Is he loyal to the king? Is he just trying to make the best life for himself that he can? Is he looking out for Esther, because Esther's queen by now, and he's thinking, well, this is technically my adopted son-in-law, so maybe I should look out for him. We don't know. Again, motivations are never made exactly clear in this story, but for whatever reason, he alerts the proper authorities, and the assassination plot is foiled, and that gets him into Xerxes' good graces, kind of, kind of. So that happens in the midst of all this plotting on the part of Haman. Well, Haman continues to plot and plan and plot and plan and plot and plan, and eventually gets to the point where he gets the king to issue a decree. And remember, those decrees cannot be changed. That on a certain day, like 8 months later, this certain people from among your great nation, O great king, who keep themselves separate and refuse to obey the law, they will be annihilated. And the king has said, okay, he doesn't really know who they are or who they're talking about. Well, lo and behold, it's the Jewish people. So when this decree goes out, Mordecai finds out and goes into mourning, tears his clothing, puts on sackcloth, which is the Jewish ritual of mourning. Esther finds out about it. They send messages back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And Mordecai tells her, God will save us, or God's actually not mentioned, which is weird in this book. But basically, he says something that sounds almost a little tiny bit prophetic, in that if you do not speak up, someone will rise up and will save us. But who is to say that you are not placed in your position of power for this very thing? So Esther risks her life to go into the court of the king without being summoned, which is a direct mirror image of what Vashti had originally denied doing. And, well, we know how things turned out for her. So Esther is risking her life by going into the court of the king. But she finds favor, throws him a banquet along with Haman 2 times in a row. And after the second time, finally says to the king, oh, hey, someone is plotting against my people. Finally, she's revealed that she's a Jewish person. Someone is plotting against my people. Give them the power to protect themselves. So that's all kind of going on. So Esther risks her life, but it turns out well. In the meantime, Mordecai still hanging out on the sidelines. Haman still plotting against him, and now that he's got his edict and he knows he's going to wipe out all the people, now he's turning his attention back towards Mordecai in general, and plans on having him killed. In fact, puts up a pole to have Mordecai impaled on, so that he dies and will be an example of, hey, this is what happens when you defy me, and I'm second in command in the whole empire, so you should really bow down to me. But Xerxes, for whatever reason, some night can't sleep, so he goes and he looks through records, probably God's work in the background, but anyway, and discovers, oh, hey, yeah, this random guy who sits at my gates all the time helped foil a plot. Did we ever give him any honor because of that? And they're like, well, no, we didn't. And he thinks, oh, well, we should honor him because he saved my life. So he calls in Haman and says, there is a man in our kingdom who deserves great honor. And Haman's pride once again jumps in. He thinks, oh, he must be talking about me. He's got to be talking about me. So he plays it up. He's like, oh, yes, you should honor this man and do this for them and do this for them and do this for them. And Haman and Xerxes says, yes, now go find Mordecai, a.k.a. your mortal enemy, and give him the honor. You personally give him the honor that you just were talking about. So now Haman gets knocked down a notch or two and has to go honor the very man that he despises, who he hates, who he wants dead. And then things continue around, and Esther reveals the plot that to destroy the Jews, that Haman is behind it. And Xerxes flies off the handle and basically has Haman killed in the very same way that he had planned on having Mordecai killed. Pride goeth before the fall, and we talked about that quite a bit. Now, I'm going to try and wrap this up as we get into the final closing part of the narrative. So the plot of Haman has been foiled, kind of. Haman has been foiled anyway. But the edict to kill all the Jewish people has already been issued. And remember, in the Persian Empire, you can't dispute that. So they release another edict, and again, this is at the prodding of Esther, to that the Jewish people can protect themselves. And it goes even a little bit beyond that, which we thought this was a little kooky, but not only is it can we protect ourselves from people who are going to be aggressive towards us, but it's the day before we can go out and kill those that we think are going to kill us. So it's like and pretty extreme, and goes it gets a little crazy. But anyway, we see behind the scenes somehow, despite the expectation of the law of the land, the law of humankind, acting, God is bigger, and God can work behind the scenes in ways that we don't understand to overcome it and protect His people, and continue that. Following this time, when the Jewish culture is saved, we hear the beginning of a new celebration for the Jewish people, and it's the festival of Purim. And it celebrates yearly this day or these 2 days when the people were saved because of the action of Esther and Mordecai. And so it's a 2-day festival, goes on every day. And again, like we talked about with the festival of Passover, for the Jewish culture, these days of remembrance are very important. So we see this establishment of a new festival, yearly annual festival. That's what's going on in this story, or this chapter. Now, next time as we go on, we're going to wrap up the coverage. It sounds like NFL. The coverage of the Old Testament as we rebuild the walls of Jerusalem kind of picks up where the previous chapter had left off. So and after that, then we'll be on break for a few weeks until after the first of the year, when we'll pick up with the New Testament, and the birth of Jesus. So that's kind of where we're getting to in terms of overarching history. If you have thoughts, questions, comments based on your reading of this chapter, please share those down in the comment section. We can continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, have a great week. We'll catch you next time, and God bless.